Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Harper. I'm a freelance researcher with Noble Pursuits, and today I'm going to be presenting our study titled Effectiveness and Use of On-Site Safely Managed Sanitation Solutions in Rural Cambodia. I was lucky enough to be the principal investigator on this study, working alongside Rana Abdel-Sattar, Marlena Ross, and Tyler Krazzoli of IDE and Causal Design. This study is particularly looking at the treatment effectiveness of on-site FSM technologies in rural Cambodia, as well as household practices around that technology. I'm also going to be highlighting some of the continuing challenges that we're facing around safely managed sanitation in rural Cambodia, specifically in climate vulnerable areas. Before I move on to the study, I just wanted to acknowledge the primary donors to the study, Australian Aid, Water for Women, and USAID, as well as the Stone Family Foundation. And as I mentioned, the three partners that made this study possible were IDE, Causal Design, and my company, Noble Pursuits. Starting off with just kind of a context, there are many FSM, fecal sludge management challenges in rural Cambodia, and they're being exacerbated by climate change, causing failures to sanitation systems and tending to increase the unsafe FSM practices that are quite common in rural Cambodia at the household level. And IDE has recently published a study that verifies this connection between climate vulnerability and sanitation. Rural Cambodia is basically characterized by having very few pit emptying service providers, as well as a lack of enforcement of safe disposal of fecal sludge. And therefore, households tend to empty their own pits using kind of practices that they develop themselves, which are generally unsafe, exposing them to the pathogens that are present in fecal sludge. So as a result, the sector has kind of moved towards studying and recommending the installation of only on-site treatment solutions to achieve safely managed sanitation in rural Cambodia. Now, as you can see in this picture, this is an example of a single pit latrine, and you'll notice the high water mark here due to flooding. And this is just one of many examples of how climate change affects sanitation systems, both in the short term and the long term in terms of maintenance and operation. And that's a portion of what this study looks at is the treatment effectiveness of these systems. So given this basic context in rural Cambodia, and having worked in Cambodia for quite a long time to improve sanitation, in 2017, IDE introduced something called the Alternating Dual Pit, or ADP, to support progress towards safely managed sanitation across rural Cambodia. Now, the ADP is similar to an alternating twin pit design, but they have made a few changes to make it more marketable in rural Cambodia, as well as making it more easier to install by the private sector, and reducing the household's likelihood of coming into contact with untreated fecal sludge. So these context-specific changes primarily include an ADP being what's called an upgrade product. So across rural Cambodia, there are lots of single pit latrines, and when that single pit fills up, it needs to either be emptied or another pit constructed in order to maintain latrine functionality. So that's what the ADP provides. It adds a second pit that's empty. We switch over the connection to that second pit, and then the existing pit is treated with hydrated lime to increase the pH, and then separated from the latrine system to undergo what's called storage treatment. So basically, we leave it for a long period of time, and the theory is that pathogens degrade over time, in addition to that lime mixing, to reduce the likelihood of infection when the pit is eventually emptied in the future. Additionally, this new pit, as part of the ADP upgrade, is installed with what's called a pit gauge, which is effectively a float level that allows a household to see what's going on inside of their pit and to know when it's about to become full. And this is a self-monitoring tool that households can use to contact a service provider to manage their pit in the future, or knowing when they might need to empty it themselves. Now, when a household purchases an ADP, IDE sales agents provide them with a document that looks just like this that explains how to use their ADP correctly. And there's a lot of behaviors that need to happen in order to make sure that the fecal sludge being treated in an ADP is treated effectively. And these recommendations include when and how to safely empty their pit, and also when and how to switch their pits between, switch their toilet between pits. Also, it specifies the requirement or recommendation of contacting a service provider when their pits are full to help them switch and empty their pit as well. So IDE has installed over 22,000 ADP upgrades since 2017. And by early 2022, last year, there were approximately 8,000 ADPs that had been in use for approximately 2 years. Now, originally, the ADP was not designed to be climate resilient, but it is in fact the first FSM-specific technology to be sold at scale in Cambodia. So why we're considering this 2-year time frame is because of a WHO standard that states that after 2 years of storage treatment, pits have reduced their pathogenicity to the point that they can be emptied safely without any special equipment, such as gloves, goggles, etc., to kind of protect people from contact. And so that's what our study particularly looks at is that true? And this study occurs in 2 different stages, biology and behavior, because both are required in order to make an ADP effective. So the research question for biology is, can households safely empty pits that receive lime treatment as well as 2 years of storage treatment as recommended by WHO standards? We'll talk about the behavior side of things in a few minutes. So for the biology study, we went out and sampled a lot of pits, 147 real-world pits that had been in use for 2 years, or excuse me, had been undergoing treatment for 2 years, as well as underwent lime mixing at the beginning of that 2 years. And we used both linear and logistic regressions to describe how the presence, as well as the number of E. coli and fecal coliform colony-forming units varied with regard to different characteristics of the sludge in the pits, sludge pH, temperature, solid content, as well as the number of pit users and the presence of animals near the pit. There are a lot of results that I could present. This is kind of the big one. We've published 2 different articles, we've submitted 2 different articles for publication for this study. And so please look for that in the literature, but this is kind of the major finding. You can see what we're plotting here. We've got on the vertical axis, we've got the percentage of pits that contained E. coli. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got the log of the number of E. coli colony-forming units per dry gram of fecal sludge. And so it's basically a plot of the histogram of concentrations of E. coli in these pits. And the red line is basically the threshold that dictates what is safe and what is not safe by international standards. And so below the red line are pits that likely would not cause any kind of health risk when emptied without particular equipment. And any pit above the red line would likely cause a infection in humans if emptied. So 2 years of storage treatment plus lime mixing reduced the pathogen count to safe levels in approximately 2 of 3 latrine pits in rural Cambodia. It's a nice finding. With that said, approximately 1 in 3 exceeded that 1,000 E. coli CFUs per dry gram of fecal sludge, indicating that there still is a significant public health risk despite storage treatment as well as lime mixing in the real world. Now, switching gears and taking a look at the behavior side of things, we wanted to answer the question, in various contexts of rural Cambodia, do households appropriately operate and maintain their ADPs as recommended by IDE? The primary method that we used for data collection were household surveys, which included both an interview as well as observations by our field assistants. And we ended up with 770 household surveys that spanned 5 provinces of rural Cambodia. Now, our sampling frame for this portion of the study was different than the other. We targeted households that had performed FSM practices, that had likely performed FSM practices, including emptying their pits or switching their pit connection. Now, we applied regressions using 5 novel indices that described different household FSM practices with regard to their ADPs. Now, these novel indices were created by basically combining some of the questions that were included in our household survey to create composite metrics. So for example, grouping questions that talked about how households emptied their pits or how households switched their pits, created those indices, and then we ran regressions on those with a variety of factors. So a couple of the primary results: 60% of households reported not knowing how long storage treatment needed to proceed until emptying could be performed safely. This is a really interesting finding because IDE provided leaflets, as I mentioned, about how to use their ADP. And so this really highlights that rural households still lacked a fundamental knowledge of how to use their ADP, specifically related to treatment, emptying, and the safe disposal of fecal sludge. Also, we found that approximately 34% of households had done what's called pierced their pits, and that's the example of photos I have here. It's basically installing an overflow pipe or an overflow hole into the top of a pit. So as a pit fills, the liquid comes out the top, and the pit effectively never fills, and latrine functionality is maintained. However, it totally breaches the containment portion of a latrine and leaks untreated fecal sludge around the pit or very nearby the pit. So this kind of highlights an unsafe emptying practice that is still occurring with households that have an ADP. Again, highlighting that there's a lot of unsafe practices even going on with this particular on-site treatment technology. Lastly, we found that only 14% of households had followed the recommended practices with regard to switching their pits after emptying. So this again really highlights that even though in theory these systems could be used to provide effective on-site treatment, as has been shown in the lab, in the real world, human behavior, among other things, really throws that result out the window, unfortunately. It really kind of highlights that human behavior matters, and even having the best technology, it needs to be quite a lot more resilient and effective in order to account for that. Based on the results of this study, we have a lot of calls to action and sector recommendations. First off, the duration of fecal sludge storage should really be reevaluated because the practicality and effectiveness of storage treatment is really called into question. We encountered a lot of households that had emptied their pit before 2 years, and so that kind of points to the fact that storage treatment might not be, and is likely not, an effective real-world treatment mechanism. So something else that might work and should be studied is high-dose lime treatment, just as an example, kind of moving away from storage treatment. Secondly, we're really urging the sector to improve access to rural FSM service providers, and that's intended to help provide reliable, safe, and affordable treatment, emptying, and disposal of fecal sludge, particularly in vulnerable climates that experience climate-vulnerable environments that experience these issues a lot more strongly than in less climate-vulnerable environments. Lastly, governments really need to be supported by providing clear, practical FSM protocols, as well as urged to actually enforce those regulations. This is a major problem in rural Cambodia, despite the national government's really strong involvement with rural sanitation, and so our sector can definitely help them out in that regard. A few more recommendations. These are a bit more broad. So when designing FSM and climate resilient solutions, in this case on-site sanitation solutions, we really need to consider as a sector both the technical and behavioral aspects. We've heard that a few times throughout this conference, and our study really supports that. Lastly, more practical tools really need to be developed in order to easily, accurately, and affordably identify climate vulnerability and monitor progress towards safely managed sanitation in rural Cambodia and more globally. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions and would welcome any comments. If you have any questions that come up after the conference, please contact either me, James, or our research partner, Rana, via the emails shown here. Thanks very much for your attention.